What do you expect to hear from me, and what do you think you'll do with it? You can see the title of the talk, so that gives you some clues. Hopefully you're a little bit aware of the artificial intelligence phenomena that's going on. We're at an API conference. Maybe you're familiar with Gartner and you know some of the research that we do. You have your own training, your own experiences. I basically was prompted. I was given a prompt to speak. I went back and I did an interpretation of all the resources I have, and I'm about to give you that response. What are you going to do with that response? You'll either agree with it or you'll disagree with it. And how will you make that decision? You're going to use your opinion, your insights, your intuition to decide if what I say is on track or not. And then you'll decide what you're going to do with that. How many of you went to breakfast over here this morning? How many of you have ever eaten food before in your life? Okay. So when you walked in there, you were able to assess what was presented to you, right? It was basically a response. When you signed up for this conference, you implied that you expected to be taken care of. So you gave an implied prompt to say, I'm going to come to your conference, feed me breakfast, right? So they went to the resources they had, they did an interpretation, and they gave the response to you in this room. And you went in and you had to respond to that. You may have agreed with it, you may not have. I don't know, right? So you decided whether you wanted to partake of it and accept it and take that response and use it, or you went to the restaurant next door, or you went to the vending machine, you did something, right? That's a very human activity, okay? That's something that humans do. Now, I can't stop right there and say that's it, because that would be unfair to you. Because what you did, you made decisions on your own behalf when you went into breakfast this morning. How many of you have a partner or are married? How many of you have ever been sent downstairs when you're staying at a hotel and asked to get breakfast and bring it back? So in that scenario, what's different? You're making decisions for somebody else. So you're looking at the response that was given to you, and you have to make an intuitive decision. Is this going to be acceptable to my client? Right? This is going to work for my client. And you have to make a decision based on your intuition and your opinion of everything you know about your client, what you know about you, what you know about food, to decide if you're going to take that response back to your client and let them use it. It's a little bit more difficult, isn't it? Same exercise, but a little bit different type of responsibility. So the reason why, I'm on slide number 1, right? I've got to get back to my presentation, but this whole thing is really interesting to talk about because this thing is moving fast. I'm not sure why this is advancing, if I'm doing that or not. This AI phenomenon is moving fast. When I started working on this a couple of weeks ago, I thought what I was going to say was very provocative. And by the time I got off the plane yesterday, it wasn't. So things have changed that much. I'm going to go ahead and say it, but the other thing I wanted to point out while we have this opportunity is what I'm going to say today, I can only say it today. Because this plane, this flight with AI that's taken off is either going to crash and burn or it's going to continue to accelerate. If it continues to accelerate, what I'm going to say today will look obvious, even overly simplistic. If it crashes, what I say today will just be wrong. And I'm okay with that, right? I'll be able to take either way we go. But what I want to say today is give you an indication of what it's going to mean to you as developers. What it's going to mean to you to be a little bit more human in your developer activity and not quite as academic as maybe you have been in the past. So now I'll actually start my presentation. What I'm going to say to you, I'm going to try to convince you that generative AI will produce APIs and the code to consume APIs. See how that doesn't even have any meat behind it now. A few months ago, that could have sounded like something. But today, it doesn't sound like anything. I don't know if I just have heavy fingers or what, but this thing keeps advancing. So I'm going to stop using this. But it's going to produce APIs for you, and it's going to produce the code that consumes the APIs. So what does that mean to you as a developer? You're going to become more strategic, and you're going to become more intuitive. And we'll understand that a little bit more as we go along. This is the money shot right here, if I can get it to stay still. There's 2 cycles represented here. the cycle of producing APIs and the cycle of consuming APIs. And the talk that Bill gave us earlier was fantastic, because when you're up here in this cycle, what are you thinking about? You need to be thinking about how it's going to impact this cycle. What's that developer experience going to look like? What's the consistency in the style, and how is your API going to work? Are developers going to be able to find it and use it and be efficient with it? So where GenAI is going to come into play in the production cycle, it's just going to produce your API specifications, it's going to produce your test, and it's going to produce that thing that we only do 10% of the time now. Remember Bill's slide? How many APIs have documentation? 10% or less. We're going to start having that consistently for all the APIs going forward. We're going to have to go back and retrofit some of the ones we've already produced, but that's where GenAI is going to really give us a big impact right here. It's going to produce that API specification for you. Is that scary? No, because you are API developers. So when it produces that API specification, what are you going to be able to do with it? You're going to have an opinion. You're going to have your insight, because you know how to build API specifications yourself. You're trained, you have experience, so you'll have an intuitive understanding as to whether this is a good API specification or not. And then down in the development side, when you're actually using APIs to build applications, GenAI is going to find that API for you. It's going to present to you a snippet of code to invoke that API, and it's going to generate tests for you. Is that scary? No. What are you going to do with that when it's presented to you? You're going to use your opinion, your insight, and your intuition to say, do I accept this or not? Just like you did with breakfast this morning. How many of you are even aware of the AI phenomenon, GenAI? Most of us are aware of it. How many of you would consider yourself deeply literate about how it works? That's what we know, right? This thing is so phenomenal, and we're all so excited about it, but most of us don't know the details about it. But is that going to stop us from jumping in? No. Especially when we talk to leadership and what they think they can gain from it. My slides are bouncing around. This is a year old. A year ago, a survey we took told us that 13% of the people we talked to are already using GenAI in their software development. 36% were in the process of evaluating it, and 52% knew they were going to be doing it in the near future. So that means 90% at least of all organizations that build any kind of software are going to have AI-assisted tools in their software development. So what does that mean to developers? They're going to transition. Transition? Okay, this is a Gartner report. I'm going to take the liberty to argue with it because I'm a Gartner employee, right? What did we just talk about that you did at breakfast this morning? You're really not transitioning. You do this kind of thing already. You already accept things and decide if you like it or not, and you use your insight and intuition to determine if it's okay. You're going to transition to doing more of that because you're going to get code and you're going to get things built for you from GenAI. That doesn't mean that you're not valuable, because you have to be the gatekeeper. You have to decide, is this good or not? So you're going to move to a more strategic and creative. Value-driven was our way of not saying the word intuitive and sounding like we were a woo-woo kind of research firm, right? But you're going to have to be intuitive with what you're getting back from GenAI. This is another really important thing to understand. This is your new API development model, or at least one of them. So this is just one approach to using a public model. And you can see I've indicated a couple of options that are available to you there with OpenAI and Meta AI. But the way this is going to work for you is you'll use an AI model or some kind of process to ask it questions to get it to do things for you. Now, if you're using a public one, it was trained on data that was not necessarily sensitive to your organization or your enterprise, right? Do you want your responses that you get back from an LLM prompt to be just generic and have no consideration of your organization? No. You want it to be tailored as much as possible to what your organization needs. So what you do is in the prompt, you actually pass in data that is more related and more considerate of your organization. Things like your API documentation that you have today, maybe even some use cases, schemas of the data entities you're trying to work with, and your API standards, because remember, we all have API standards and guidelines. And you pass that in with the prompt, and let's see if this is going to do anything. And you ask it to build me an API. but now it has some context related to your particular question, right? It'd be like going to the restaurant and saying, please prepare dinner for me. I'm not a meat eater, I only eat vegetables, and I have a gluten allergy. And now what they bring back to you is going to be more considerate of what you need. And if you pass these types of documents in with your prompt, then you'll be able to get a response back even from a public model that's more considerate of your demand. This is called retrieval augmented generated, sometimes referred to RAG, if you hear the word RAG. This is just one approach if you're going to use a public type of model to get some responses back. But what I'm trying to get to is your development process now is that prompt. Build an API that gets me customer profile. Build an API that gets me item information. Build an API that calculates sales tax, whatever it is. Or you're the application developer and you need an API to finish an application. So your prompt now is going to be, I need customer profile information. I need item information. I need to calculate sales tax. And the tool is going to now go find that API for you. And so you get your response, and then you decide what you're going to do with that response. You're going to get that snippet of code, and you're still going to have to be aware enough and understand if that's going to be appropriate for what you need. Is that going to meet your standards? Is it going to meet the requirements? Is it going to work? Just because something else generated it for you doesn't mean that you lost your value in the chain, in the life cycle of this. You still have to be the gatekeeper in this. But what it does mean is now you're going to have, in your world of APIs, the ones that are human built, that you're building or your team members are building. We have for years been having tools that build APIs. We've got integration tools that you can point at a good data schema and it'll generate an API for you. That's existed for a long time already. What we're introducing now is more APIs that are going to be built from GenAI as well. So there are going to be more performers out there building these APIs. And so I can't let Bill one-up me. I have to participate in his idea of looking at the music industry, right? So if you look at these APIs as if they're different types of sound that are being produced for you, how does a conductor deal with all these different performers and all these different technologies that are producing sound in his orchestra? He's got wind, brass, and string, all with a different technology and opinion about how to make sound, different ways of making sound. Can you imagine how that would just be chaos if there wasn't some kind of organization around that. How does he manage it? Through orchestration, common notation, sheet music. You should study that sometime. You want to see something about the evolution of standards. The amount of information that's in sheet music is unbelievable. And then you synchronize everybody to the same tuning. So now all these different performers with these different technologies to make music produce something beautiful that the composer wanted to give to the audience, and you can actually deliver it now. The same thing with your APIs. You're going to be orchestrating them. You're going to need the right documentation, and you're going to need standards and guidelines, or you'll lose what Bill was talking about. You will not have that consistency. You will not have that security. You will not have the common style across all of them. It's going to look much more like the Beatles than the Weezers, right? If you don't have these kind of standards in place. Now let's back up for a minute. We've been talking about building APIs, producing APIs, and consuming them as application developers. What about software vendors themselves? Are they on board with this? Well, probably next year or certainly the year after, at least 70% of any software product you touch is going to have an AI component to it. AI itself is going to become an API consumer, right? AI tools are going to be looking into APIs and executing them and invoking them to get data and information to build their models with. And how can an automated machine read your API and consume it if there's not documentation there or specifications that it can automatically read, right? So now you have a new client as well as the applications you're building for. All these AI tools out here are going to read your APIs. So that means we have to come back to this model here and think about one other entry, one other persona that's going to be part of this. That green circle in the middle is where you're hosting the APIs that you're building and applications are consuming. That's where your API gateway is. That's where you're hosting these APIs. AI components are going to be looking at your APIs as well. And then there's going to be tooling and utilities built into these gateways. Kong is already announcing this. You may find now when you look at a gateway that hosts an API, you'll see a utility where you have like a unified API for AI tools. that already lets you have a way to access whatever public AI tool you might want to use. You'll see assistance for building your prompts, and you may even see response augmentation, where you can tell the gateway, whenever I go to get this customer information, automatically translate it to me for these 3 different languages that we know are part of our customer base. Those kind of things are going to be available to you through AI. And since that's going to be a big part of it, prompting is a big part of everything we're going to do with GenAI, you're not going to be able to do that by yourself. I mean, you probably can, but you're going to have assistance with it. And as a matter of fact, we predict that 80% of all the prompting you do, you're going to have some kind of assistance with that to build the prompt correctly. So when you look at the activities or the responsibilities of producing an API and using APIs, that API specification, GenAI is going to generate that for you. Test scripts, GenAI is going to generate that for you. Documentation, and then on the application development side, the code to invoke that API, GenAI can generate that for you. Does that alleviate you from any responsibility? Who is still the gatekeeper in all this? You are. So don't be nervous about this GenAI thing. I mean, it's going to do some of the busy work for you, which should you look at as a productivity enhancement, but it's not going to be a productivity enhancer for you if you take a suggested piece of code from GenAI and you basically write it yourself and compare to make sure it's okay, or you spend all day going through it. How do you make the decision quicker so that you can actually get that productivity gain? When you walked into the breakfast room this morning, did you have to know all the ingredients and the process they went through to make those eggs or whatever was there, or the muffins? You had to be able to make an intuitive decision. Does this right? Do I agree with this? Is this okay? So when GenAI hands you something, you're going to have to be smart enough and have the wherewithal and have the intuitive ability to say, this is good, we're going to run with this. And you only are able to do that because you're already trained, you're experienced. This is actually going to create a much more strategic position for you. The overall solution architecture, GenAI is not going to help with that. Who's going to own that 100%? You are. You're going to be responsible for that. Another way to look at this, the dark blue boxes are where GenAI can assist, and the other boxes are where only humans can participate. So GenAI can do the things we've talked about, writing code, debugging code, testing, so forth. But when it comes to understanding things, when it comes to mentoring and learning your associates or your teammates or your stakeholders and your clients, when it comes to interruptions, interruptions mean somebody raises their hand and says, we're not going the right direction, there's a cliff ahead. Who's going to be doing that? We still have to do that. So you're going to continue to be a developer. As a matter of fact, it's going to be just as important as understanding what food is and you go into a restaurant and being able to decide, do I agree with what I see in front of me? You're going to have to understand code. You're going to have to understand APIs. You're going to have to understand everything about them and all the things Bill talked about before me. But you're also going to be a conductor because you're going to have a lot more personas and a lot more sources that are going to provide APIs to you and the specifications and the code. That just saves you time. But it only saves you time if you know how to interrogate it and understand if it's right or not. So I hope what I've proven to you is what I said earlier a few minutes ago. GenAI will produce APIs, and it will produce the code to consume APIs, which means that as developers, we're going to have to become more creative, strategic, and intuitive so that we can use what we get from GenAI and actually realize the productivity gains. It's not all for free, and this is my little caveat to say I could be wrong, right? Because there are some cautions that we still need to realize. This plane could still crash and burn. It's not looking like it's going to, but we're still determining just how reliable AI is in the LLM models that we have today. So we're still trying to determine that we can trust the reliability. We all have to accept it. We have to accept it into our processes. We have to get that governance in place that I was talking about before. If you're going to allow GenAI to produce API specifications for you, it needs to also be adhering to your standards and guidelines. The cost of orchestration could offset productivity. So if you're spending too much time evaluating everything you get from GenAI, you're not saving any time. So you need to make sure that you've got those things around it where the governance has been inserted to it, you know it's abiding by standards and guidelines, and you understand the requirements and the prompt well enough to know if the response is right or not. So you have a bigger responsibility in a lot of regards. We need to protect ourselves from black box conditions. All of a sudden we have something and nobody knows what it does because it got generated by GenAI. We have to avoid that. And then the other thing, if we're going to participate with all the productivity gains that AI can give us, we need to be able to work with AI and with the public domain models, which means that your APIs need to be understandable, which means your APIs, the other 90% you didn't document it, need to get documented. So there's going to be a piece of work for all of us to do to catch up on that. So that's the end of my presentation. If you're interested in knowing more about Gartner or what we can do for you or in your organization, just let me know, and I'll be glad to talk to you about that. Thank you very much.